Captain Rebecca Martinez had been flying military helicopters for 12 years, but she'd never faced anything like this. The enemy had somehow infiltrated their communication systems and jammed every control interface in her Black Hawk during what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission over hostile territory. As warning lights flashed across her dashboard like a Christmas tree from hell, she realized that conventional flying was no longer an option. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Jake Thompson, was frantically trying to restore manual control while their crew chief, Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, worked on the radio systems from the back. The helicopter lurched violently as Rebecca fought to maintain altitude using only the collective pitch control, which thankfully remained partially functional. Below them, enemy forces were mobilizing, having detected their aircraft's distress. "Ma'am, I can't get any of the primary systems back online," Jake reported through gritted teeth. "Whatever they've done to our electronics, it's like they've turned our bird into a flying brick." Rebecca's mind raced through her training. She'd studied every possible scenario, but this was beyond anything the flight manual had prepared her for. Then she remembered something from her early days in the service. An old Vietnam-era pilot had once told her about extreme emergency procedures that were barely documented. Among them was a technique so unconventional that it had become legend rather than standard operating procedure. "Maria, can you establish any kind of signal transmission at all?" Rebecca called back to her crew chief. "I've got intermittent contact with base, but it's weak and heavily disrupted," Maria replied. "The jamming is sophisticated, but I might be able to punch through with short bursts." Rebecca's training kicked in as she recalled the theoretical framework she'd learned about emergency communication protocols. If she could establish a basic signal transmission, she might be able to use Morse code to communicate with the helicopter's backup systems. It was a long shot, but modern military aircraft still maintained hardwired emergency overrides that could potentially respond to coded electrical impulses. The helicopter shuddered as they lost more altitude. Rebecca knew they had maybe 10 minutes before they'd be forced to attempt an emergency landing in enemy territory. The jamming was so complete that even their GPS was compromised, leaving them essentially blind except for visual navigation. "Jake, I need you to help me access the emergency bypass panel," Rebecca commanded. "We're going to try something that's either going to save our lives or get us court-martialed." As enemy aircraft appeared on the horizon, Rebecca began implementing a plan that would either prove her ingenuity or become her final mistake. The unconventional approach she was about to attempt had never been tried under combat conditions, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Jake looked at her with a mixture of confusion and trust. "What do you need me to do, Captain?" "We're going to fly this bird using nothing but dots and dashes." Rebecca's plan was based on a theoretical concept she'd encountered during advanced training. Modern military helicopters had backup systems that could receive basic electrical impulses, even when primary controls were compromised. If she could generate Morse code signals through the helicopter's emergency electrical system, she might be able to communicate with the aircraft's fundamental control mechanisms. The enemy jamming was sophisticated, but it was focused on disrupting digital communications and computer-controlled systems. The older, more basic electrical pathways that governed essential functions like rotor pitch and engine throttle were hardwired and might still be accessible through direct electrical manipulation. Maria, I need you to find the emergency electrical panel behind your station, Rebecca instructed while fighting to keep the helicopter stable. There should be a series of manual switches that can send electrical pulses to different systems. Maria quickly located the panel, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the aircraft's violent movements. "Found it, Captain. I see switches labeled for rotor systems, engine controls, and navigation backups." Rebecca began explaining her desperate plan. Each Morse code signal would correspond to a specific flight control input. A dot would represent a brief electrical pulse, while a dash would be a longer pulse. By sending these signals in predetermined patterns, she hoped to communicate with the helicopter's backup systems and override the jamming. "The letter U in Morse code is dot dot dash," Rebecca explained. "That's going to be our signal for up or increasing power. The letter D is dash dot dot, which we'll use for down or decreasing power. We need to establish a complete alphabet of flight controls." Jake was beginning to understand the complexity of what they were attempting. "Captain, this is insane. You're talking about flying a helicopter by essentially typing to it in Morse code. Insane is staying in the air with no control while enemy fighters close in on us," Rebecca replied grimly. "Maria, start with the rotor pitch controls. Send 3 short pulses, pause, then 3 long pulses. Let's see if we can get any response." As Maria worked the switches, Rebecca felt a slight change in the helicopter's behavior. The rotor pitch seemed to respond marginally to the electrical impulses, giving her a glimmer of hope that her unconventional approach might actually work. The enemy aircraft were getting closer, and Rebecca knew they had to act fast. She began dictating a series of Morse code patterns that would hopefully allow them to regain basic flight control and escape the dangerous situation they found themselves in. "Jake, grab the manual and find the emergency electrical bypass procedures," Rebecca commanded. "I need you to help me create a communication protocol that our bird can understand." As Jake fumbled through the thick manual, Rebecca continued to fight with the partially responsive controls. The helicopter was losing altitude steadily, and the enemy forces below were tracking their position. Time was running out. "Got it," Jake announced. "There's a section here about emergency electrical overrides. It mentions that certain systems can be activated through direct electrical pulse sequences, but it warns that improper use could damage the aircraft's electrical systems." At this point, a damaged helicopter is better than a crashed one, Rebecca replied. "Maria, let's try the engine throttle controls. Send the Morse code for P, that's dot dash dash dot. We'll use that for power increase." Maria carefully manipulated the electrical switches, sending the precise sequence of pulses to the engine control systems. Almost immediately, they felt the engines respond with increased power, giving them a much-needed boost in altitude. "It's working," Jake exclaimed. "The engines are responding to the Morse code signals." Rebecca allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. If they could establish reliable communication with the helicopter's essential systems, they might be able to navigate out of enemy territory and back to their base. But they needed to work quickly and systematically to establish a complete control protocol. "All right, let's establish our basic flight control alphabet," Rebecca said. "Maria, for forward movement we'll use F dot dot dash dot. For backward we'll use B dash dot dot dot. Left turn will be L dot dash dot dot and right turn will be R dot dash dot." As they worked to establish their improvised communication system, Rebecca couldn't help but think about how surreal their situation was. Here they were, flying a sophisticated military helicopter, using a communication method that had been developed over a century ago for telegraph operators. The enemy fighters were now visible on the horizon, and Rebecca knew they had to implement their Morse code flight system immediately. "Maria, send the sequence for power increase followed by forward movement. Let's see if we can get some distance between us and those fighters." Maria's fingers worked frantically on the electrical switches, sending the coded signals to the helicopter's systems. The aircraft responded, climbing and moving forward with renewed purpose. "Jake, start plotting a course back to base using only visual landmarks," Rebecca instructed. "We're going to have to navigate this thing manually while communicating with it in Morse code." As Jake studied the terrain below, Rebecca refined their communication system. She realized they needed more precise control signals to navigate effectively. The basic directional commands were working, but they needed to add nuance to their flight control vocabulary. "Maria, let's add altitude controls to our system," Rebecca said. "For climb, we'll use C dash dot dash dot. For descent, we'll use C dot dot dot. And for hover, we'll use H dot 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 dot." The helicopter responded to each command with increasing precision. Rebecca was amazed at how well the backup systems were interpreting their Morse code signals. It was as if the aircraft was learning to understand their desperate communication attempts. Enemy fighters were now closing in fast, and Rebecca knew they had to take evasive action. Maria, send rapid sequences of left and right turn signals. Let's see if we can make ourselves a harder target. As Maria worked the switches in quick succession, the helicopter began to move in an erratic pattern that made it difficult for the enemy aircraft to lock onto their position. The Morse code flight system was proving to be more versatile than Rebecca had initially hoped. "Captain, I've got a visual on the mountain range that marks our territory," Jake reported. "If we can maintain this course for another 15 minutes, we should be able to reach friendly airspace." Rebecca nodded grimly. 15 minutes felt like an eternity when flying a helicopter using Morse code while being pursued by enemy fighters. They needed to maintain their speed and altitude while avoiding detection. "Maria, let's try to establish a cruise control pattern," Rebecca suggested. "Send alternating power increase and forward movement signals. We need to maintain steady progress toward the border." As they implemented their improvised cruise control system, Rebecca began to feel more confident about their chances of survival. The Morse code communication was becoming more natural, and the helicopter was responding with increasing reliability. But their relief was short-lived. The enemy fighters had closed to within firing range, and Rebecca could see missile trails streaking through the air toward their position. They needed to take immediate evasive action. "Emergency maneuvers," Rebecca shouted. "Maria, rapid sequence down, left, down, right, up. We need to dodge those missiles." Maria's hands flew over the electrical switches, sending the complex sequence of Morse code signals to the helicopter's control systems. The aircraft responded with a series of violent maneuvers that threw all three crew members against their restraints. The missiles streaked past their position, missing by mere meters. Rebecca realized that their unconventional flight control system might actually be an advantage in combat situations, as it created unpredictable movement patterns that were difficult for enemy targeting systems to track. "We're not out of this yet," Rebecca warned. "Those fighters are regrouping for another attack run." Rebecca's mind raced as she considered their options. The Morse code system was working, but they needed to be more strategic about their escape. The enemy fighters were faster and more maneuverable than their helicopter, but they had one advantage: the unpredictability of their flight patterns. "Jake, what's the terrain like ahead?" Rebecca asked while maintaining visual contact with the pursuing aircraft. "There's a series of deep valleys and canyons about 5 miles ahead," Jake reported. "If we can reach them, we might be able to use the terrain to our advantage. Rebecca knew that flying through canyons would require extremely precise control. Under normal circumstances, it would be challenging enough with full flight controls. Attempting it with Morse code communication would be nearly impossible, but it might be their only chance. Maria, we're going to need to develop more sophisticated control signals, Rebecca explained. We need fine-tuned adjustments, not just basic movements. Maria nodded, her hands poised over the electrical switches. What do you need, Captain? Let's establish degree-specific turning commands, Rebecca said. For slight left, we'll use Q dash dash dot dash. For slight right, we'll use X dash dot dot dash. For sharp left, we'll use L as before, and for sharp right, we'll use R. As they approached the canyon system, Rebecca began to implement her plan. The helicopter would need to navigate through narrow passages while maintaining enough speed to stay ahead of the enemy fighters. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was their best option. Maria, start with forward movement and slight descent, Rebecca commanded. We need to lose altitude gradually as we approach the canyon entrance. The helicopter responded to the Morse code signals, beginning its descent toward the rocky terrain below. Rebecca could feel the aircraft system straining under the unconventional control method, but they were holding together. Enemy fighters were now directly behind them, and Rebecca could see the pilots preparing for another missile attack. "Emergency descent," she shouted. "Maria, send continuous descent signals," she repeated rapidly. The helicopter dove toward the canyon floor, and Rebecca felt her stomach drop as they plummeted through the air. The enemy missiles streaked overhead, missing their target as they pulled into the protective cover of the canyon walls. "We're in the canyon system," Jake reported, "but the passage ahead narrows significantly. We're going to need extremely precise navigation." Rebecca knew this was the moment of truth. If their Morse code system could handle the precision required for canyon navigation, they might actually survive this ordeal. If not, they would crash into the rocky walls that surrounded them. "Maria, we need to establish a rhythm," Rebecca said. "Alternate between forward movement and directional adjustments. Think of it like playing a piano. Each signal needs to be timed perfectly." As they began their treacherous journey through the canyon, Rebecca marveled at how their desperate improvisation had evolved into a sophisticated communication system. The canyon walls towered above them, creating a natural fortress that provided protection from the enemy fighters, but also presented new challenges. The narrow passages required constant adjustments to their flight path, and the rocky terrain created unpredictable air currents that threatened to throw them off course. "Maria, we need to develop a system for dealing with wind gusts," Rebecca said as the helicopter lurched suddenly. When you feel the aircraft being pushed by wind, send 3 rapid dots followed by the appropriate directional correction. Maria quickly adapted to the new protocol, her hands moving with increasing confidence over the electrical switches. The helicopter responded to each command with remarkable precision, as if the aircraft was learning to understand their unique communication method. "Captain, the enemy fighters are having trouble following us into the canyon," Jake observed. "They're maintaining altitude above the canyon rim, but they can't get a clear shot at us." Rebecca allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Their unconventional escape plan was working, but they still had miles of dangerous terrain to navigate before reaching safety. The canyon system was like a maze, with multiple passages branching off in different directions. "Jake, which route gives us the best chance of reaching friendly territory?" Rebecca asked while maintaining focus on their flight path. "The main canyon continues for about 12 miles before opening into a valley near our forward operating base," Jake replied. "But there's a section about halfway through where the passage gets extremely narrow. We'll need to fly single file through a gap that's barely wider than our rotor span." Rebecca's heart sank. Flying through such a narrow passage would require absolute precision, something that was challenging even with full flight controls. Attempting it with Morse code communication would be incredibly dangerous. "We don't have a choice," Rebecca said grimly. "The enemy fighters are still tracking us from above. If we try to leave the canyon system, they'll be waiting for us." As they continued deeper into the canyon, Rebecca began to refine their communication system even further. She realized that they needed to anticipate the helicopter's responses and send commands slightly before they were needed, accounting for the delay between signal transmission and aircraft response. "Maria, let's add a new command for prepare to adjust," Rebecca suggested. "Use the letter a dot dash. Send that signal about 2 seconds before any major directional change." This preparatory signal allowed the helicopter's systems to ready themselves for incoming commands, resulting in smoother and more predictable responses. Rebecca was amazed at how adaptable their improvised system had become. "The narrow passage is coming up in about 2 miles," Jake warned. "I can see it ahead. It's going to be tight." Rebecca knew this would be their greatest challenge yet. The passage was so narrow that any mistake could result in the helicopter's rotors striking the canyon walls, which would mean certain death for all 3 crew members. "Maria, when we reach the narrow section, I want you to send only the most essential commands," Rebecca instructed. "Forward movement, slight adjustments only. No rapid maneuvers." As they approached the narrow passage, Rebecca could see the canyon walls closing in around them. The opening ahead looked impossibly small, barely wide enough for their helicopter to fit through. The margin for error was essentially zero. Beginning approach to narrow passage, Jake announced. We're going to need perfect precision for the next 3 minutes. Rebecca took a deep breath and focused all her attention on the task ahead. The Morse code system had worked well so far, but this would be the ultimate test of their improvised communication method. One wrong signal could send them crashing into the unforgiving rock walls. Maria, send preparatory signal followed by forward movement, Rebecca commanded. Keep the signals steady and consistent. As they entered the narrow passage, Rebecca felt the helicopter's rotors creating turbulence as they churned the air in the confined space. The canyon walls were so close that she could see individual rocks and cracks in the stone surfaces. Slight left adjustment needed, Jake called out as he monitored their position relative to the canyon walls. Maria, send A for prepare, then Q for slight left, Rebecca instructed. The helicopter responded smoothly to the Morse code signals, adjusting its position just enough to maintain safe clearance from the canyon walls. Rebecca was amazed at how precise their communication had become through necessity and practice. We're about halfway through the narrow section, Jake reported. The passage widens slightly ahead, but we need to maintain this level of precision for another minute. Rebecca's hands were cramped from maintaining her grip on the partially functional controls, but she didn't dare relax her concentration. The Morse code system required constant attention and perfect timing to keep them safely navigating through the treacherous terrain. There's a slight curve ahead, Jake warned. We'll need to adjust our heading by about 10 degrees to the right. Maria, prepare for right adjustment, Rebecca commanded. Send A followed by X for slight right. The helicopter began to turn gradually, following the curve of the canyon passage. Rebecca could feel the aircraft systems responding to their commands with increasing sophistication, as if the helicopter was learning to interpret their intentions. We're through the narrow section, Jake announced with obvious relief. The canyon opens up ahead. Rebecca felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had successfully navigated the most dangerous part of their escape route using nothing but Morse code communication. But they weren't safe yet. They still had several miles of canyon to traverse before reaching friendly territory. Enemy fighters are still circling above the canyon, Jake observed. They're tracking our progress but can't engage us while we're in the canyon system. Rebecca knew the fighters would be waiting for them when they eventually emerged from the canyon. They needed to develop a plan for dealing with the enemy aircraft once they reached the open valley near their base. Maria, let's start working on high-speed maneuver commands, Rebecca suggested. When we leave the canyon, we're going to need to move fast. Rebecca began developing a new set of Morse code signals, specifically designed for high-speed evasive maneuvers. They would need to be able to execute rapid direction changes and altitude adjustments while maintaining maximum forward speed. For emergency speed increase, we'll use Z dash dash dot dot, Rebecca explained. For emergency evasive maneuvers, we'll use E dot. Send it repeatedly for continuous evasion. As they continued through the canyon, Rebecca noticed that the helicopter's responses were becoming even more precise. The aircraft seemed to be adapting to their communication method, almost as if it was learning to anticipate their commands. The canyon exit is about 3 miles ahead, Jake reported. I can see the valley opening up, but I also see enemy fighters circling the area. Rebecca knew they would need to execute a perfect escape maneuver when they emerged from the canyon. The enemy fighters would be waiting for them, and they would have only seconds to reach the safety of their base's air defense perimeter. Maria, when we exit the canyon, we're going to need to execute a complex sequence of maneuvers, Rebecca explained. Emergency speed increase, followed by evasive maneuvers, then a direct course toward the base. As they approached the canyon exit, Rebecca could see their base in the distance. The forward operating base was surrounded by anti-aircraft defenses that would provide protection once they reached the perimeter. But they had to survive the gauntlet of enemy fighters first. Prepare for canyon exit, Jake announced. Enemy fighters are in position above the valley. Rebecca took a deep breath and prepared for the most challenging part of their escape. The transition from the protected canyon environment to the open valley would be the moment of greatest danger. Maria, on my command, send the emergency speed sequence, Rebecca instructed. We're going to burst out of this canyon at maximum speed. The helicopter approached the canyon exit, and Rebecca could see the enemy fighters adjusting their positions to intercept them. This was the moment that would determine whether their desperate improvisation would save their lives or end in disaster. Execute emergency speed, Rebecca commanded. Maria's hands flew over the electrical switches, sending the rapid sequence of Morse code signals that would push the helicopter to its maximum performance. The aircraft responded with a surge of power that pressed all 3 crew members back into their seats. As they burst from the canyon into the open valley, Rebecca immediately began calling out evasive maneuver commands. Emergency evasion, continuous E-signals. The helicopter began to move in an erratic pattern that made it difficult for the enemy fighters to track their position. The Morse code system was proving to be incredibly effective for creating unpredictable flight patterns. Base defense perimeter is 2 miles ahead, Jake shouted over the noise of the engines and rotors. Rebecca could see missile trails streaking through the air around them as the enemy fighters attempted to shoot them down. But the helicopter's erratic movement, controlled entirely through Morse code signals, was making it nearly impossible for the enemies to achieve a target lock. "We're almost there," Rebecca called out. "Maintain evasive maneuvers until we reach the defense perimeter." The helicopter continued its erratic flight pattern as they approached the base. Rebecca could see the anti-aircraft systems coming online, preparing to engage the enemy fighters that were pursuing them. The friendly fire control systems would need to identify their helicopter as friendly before opening fire on their pursuers. "Maria, we need to send an identification signal to the base," Rebecca realized. "Use the emergency identification sequence." I repeated 5 times, followed by our call sign in Morse code. Maria quickly transmitted the identification signals while maintaining the evasive maneuver commands. The helicopter's systems were being pushed to their limits, but they were holding together under the extreme stress of their unconventional flight control method. "Base defense systems are engaging the enemy fighters," Jake announced with excitement. "Surface-to-air missiles are launching." Rebecca watched as the enemy fighters were forced to break off their attack to deal with the incoming missiles from the base defenses. Their desperate escape plan had worked. They had successfully evaded capture and reached safety using nothing but Morse code to control their aircraft. "We're in the defense perimeter," Jake shouted. "We made it." As they approached the landing pad, Rebecca realized they faced one final challenge. Landing the helicopter using Morse code would require incredible precision. They would need to reduce speed, adjust altitude, and position the aircraft exactly over the landing zone. "Maria, let's establish landing sequence commands," Rebecca said. "We need to be able to control our descent rate and horizontal position with perfect accuracy." Rebecca began developing a new set of Morse code signals, specifically for landing procedures. They would need commands for gradual descent, hover, and precise positioning adjustments to safely land the helicopter. "For landing approach, we'll use V... Rebecca explained. "For final descent, we'll use W... For hover, we'll use H as before." As they approached the landing pad, Rebecca could see ground crews rushing to assist them. The base personnel were amazed to see the helicopter arriving safely despite the obvious damage to its electronic systems. "Beginning landing sequence," Rebecca announced. "Maria, send landing approach signal followed by gradual descent commands." The helicopter responded to the Morse code signals, beginning its descent toward the landing pad. Rebecca felt a sense of pride as she realized they had achieved something that had never been done before, successfully flying and landing a military helicopter using only Morse code communication. "Reduce forward speed," Rebecca commanded. "We need to establish a stable hover over the landing zone." Maria transmitted the appropriate signals, and the helicopter settled into a steady hover above the landing pad. The aircraft systems were still responding to their Morse code commands with remarkable precision. "Final descent sequence," Rebecca announced. "Gentle and controlled, we've come too far to mess this up now." The helicopter began its final descent, touching down on the landing pad with barely a bump. As the engines wound down, Rebecca felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. They had successfully completed what might have been the most unconventional helicopter flight in military history. "We did it," Jake said with amazement. "We actually flew that thing using Morse code." Rebecca smiled as she began shutting down the helicopter's systems. "I never thought I'd be grateful for learning Morse code in basic training." As the ground crews swarmed around the helicopter, Rebecca, Jake, and Maria began the process of documenting their incredible experience. The military would need to understand exactly how they had managed to fly the aircraft using such an unconventional method. Captain Martinez called out Colonel David Harrison, the base commander, as he approached the aircraft. "I need a full briefing on what happened out there. Our radar showed you were under electronic attack, but somehow you managed to evade enemy fighters and return safely." Rebecca climbed out of the helicopter, her legs shaky from the adrenaline and stress of the flight. "Sir, we lost all conventional flight controls due to enemy jamming. We had to develop an alternative communication method to maintain control of the aircraft." Colonel Harrison looked skeptical. "What kind of alternative communication method?" "Morse code, sir," Rebecca replied. "We used the emergency electrical systems to send coded signals to the helicopter's backup control mechanisms." The colonel's expression shifted from skepticism to amazement. "You're telling me you flew a Black Hawk helicopter using Morse code?" "Yes, sir. Sergeant Rodriguez operated the electrical switches while I called out the commands. Lieutenant Thompson handled navigation and terrain identification." Colonel Harrison was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what he had just heard. "This is unprecedented. We need to get our technical experts to examine the aircraft immediately. If what you're saying is true, we may have discovered a new method for maintaining aircraft control under electronic warfare conditions." Within hours, the base was buzzing with activity as engineers and technicians swarmed over the helicopter. They needed to understand exactly how the Morse code system had interfaced with the aircraft's backup control mechanisms. Dr. Patricia Anderson, the base's chief electronics engineer, was particularly interested in the technical aspects of their achievement. Captain Martinez, can you walk me through the specific electrical pathways you used to communicate with the helicopter? Rebecca spent the next several hours working with Dr. Anderson to recreate the Morse code communication system. They discovered that the helicopter's backup electrical systems were more sophisticated than anyone had realized. The aircraft has hardwired emergency overrides that can bypass the main computer systems, Dr. Anderson explained. Your Morse code signals were essentially speaking directly to these backup systems, allowing you to maintain basic flight control even with the primary systems compromised. The implications were staggering. If military aircraft could be modified to better support Morse code communication, it would provide a backup control method that would be virtually impossible for enemies to jam or disrupt. We need to develop this into a formal emergency procedure, Colonel Harrison decided. All helicopter pilots should be trained in this technique in case they ever face a similar situation. Rebecca found herself at the center of a military revolution. Her desperate improvisation had led to the development of a new emergency flight control protocol that would be implemented across the entire helicopter fleet. Captain, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross, Colonel Harrison announced. What you accomplished today will save lives and give our pilots a crucial advantage in electronic warfare scenarios. Over the following weeks, Rebecca worked with engineers and training specialists to develop a comprehensive Morse code flight control curriculum for military pilots.